Welcome to the Ad Nauseam podcast, where classical gourmands everywhere can finally get their fill. Join us for a delectable discussion of Greco-Roman civilization stretching from the Minoans and Mycenaeans through the Renaissance and right down to the present. And now, ladies and gentlemen, here are your hosts, Dr. David Noe and Dr. Jeff Winkle.
Welcome, Ad Nauseam listeners, to episode 57 of our podcast. As usual, I am Dr. David C. Noe, and I'm here in the vomitorium with my good friend and fantastic co-host, Dr. Jeff T. Winkle.
Yes, you are. I'm right here.
And how are you doing, Jeff?
I'm doing great today. How you doing, Dave?
I am so excited about this episode.
Yeah.
Are you excited?
Yes, I'm really excited. Maybe a little apprehensive, a little nervous, but
why?
No, it's because this is a big deal.
This is a big name, isn't it?
Yes.
This is a really. We're so blessed to have Heather on the. Oops, I gave it away, didn't I?
Yes, you did.
Of course, I gave it away last week too.
That's right. So if listeners will understand.
Well, let's go on to the shout out.
Okay.
And then we'll get on to the quote and so forth.
Let's do it. Who do we got?
So here this week we have William DeMann. Will DeMann.
Will DeMann.
Yeah. So Will is a recent graduate of Calvin University and a social studies teacher. His favorite classical work is the Philoctetes.
Really?
Yes.
I don't think I've ever heard that before.
From anybody.
No. I mean, I love that play, but I've
Yes.
never heard that people would say that's my favorite.
This is Sophocles, right? The
Yep.
guy gets shot in the stinky heel and he dies?
He doesn't. He has to. Odysseus has to come and get his bow before he dies.
Oh, that's right.
But he's stuck in a cave with a stinky foot.
And he's got just a horrible stench filling the island.
Yes.
Right. Okay, so Will likes the Philoctetes, particularly the, I'm going to mispronounce this, Seamus sorry, Seamus Heaney.
Oh, my God.
Seamus
Heaney.
He likes the Seamus Heaney translation. Quote, he tries to flex his meager Latin abilities on his students whenever he can. That sounds awkward. Using it to help them break down large academic vocabulary. He loves, here's the good part, Winkle, because this is the part about us.
Oh, yeah.
He loves to listen to the podcast while doing chores because it helps him work his mind alongside his hands.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Will.
Absolutely, Will. Thanks for listening. We appreciate you keeping the flame alive out there, teaching social studies, bringing some Latin into it.
It's really hard for me not to say you demand.
You demand.
So I'm not going to say it. I'm going to say it by not saying it.
Especially since there's a good chance he has never,
he's never heard that before.
Exactly.
So, Will, that's for you.
That's right.
So, Dave, what's going on in the podcast today?
Again, this is a special moment for us. We have on the show today Heather MacDonald.
Yes.
So I'd like to read just a little bit of her biography because this is incredible. Heather MacDonald is the Thomas W. Smith Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a contributing editor of City Journal and a New York Times bestselling author. She is a recipient of the 2005 Bradley Prize. MacDonald's work at City Journal has covered a range of topics, including higher education, immigration, policing, homelessness, and homeless advocacy, criminal justice reform, and race relations.
Wow. A polymath.
There's more. Her writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, New Republic, and the New Criterion. And MacDonald's newest book, The Diversity Delusion. Here's the whole title. The Diversity Delusion, How Race and Gender Pandering Corrupt the University and Undermine Our Culture, 2018.
Man, oh man. But today we're not talking with her about political issues, but the kind of the underpinnings of her thought of coming from her education.
Correct,
yes.
Correct. So maybe we should give the listener just a little bit of a background of how it is that we have Heather on the show.
Yeah, do that.
So you and I have both been longtime fans of her work, things she's written online. About a decade ago, I read her work, Are Cops Racist? And I've paid attention to her. I mean, the answer she gives, of course, is no. And it's a controversial answer, but her research is absolutely stellar. So if you want to disagree with the thesis, that's fine. But I think you owe it to the argument to dig down deep into the details and, see whether she's wrong or right.
Right.
But as I was reading through this work, The Diversity Delusion, I thought, maybe I should just contact Heather and see if she'd like to come on our podcast. And she has been unfailingly gracious and kind since that moment.
Yeah. So I think a lesson out there is just ask.
Just ask.
Yeah.
Correct.
But we are extremely grateful to Heather for agreeing to come on the show. And Dave, you got the opening quote, right?
Yes, I do. I'm holding the book right here in my hand. So this is from The Diversity Delusion, 2018, page 221. Heather says, humanistic learning is also an end in itself. It is simply better to have escaped one's narrow, petty self and entered minds far more subtle and vast than one's own than never to have done so. The Renaissance philosopher Marsilio Ficino said that a man lives as many millennia as are embraced by his knowledge of history. One could add, a man lives as many different lives as are embraced by his encounters with literature, music, and all the humanities and arts. These forms of expression allow us to see and feel things that we would otherwise never experience. Society in a 19th century Russian feudal estate, for example, or the perfect crystalline brooks and mossy shades of pastoral poetry, or the exquisite languor of a Chopin nocturne. Ultimately, humanistic study is the loving duty we owe those artists and thinkers whose works so transform us. It keeps them alive as well as us, as Petrarch and Poggio Bracciolini understood. The academic narcissist, insensate to beauty and nobility, trapped in the diversity delusion, knows none of this.
Now, was that the quote when you read it, you thought, hey, she might be a good guest for the show?
Precisely so.
Okay.
Right? I knew that she had this keen mind for analyzing societal and cultural material. I didn't know that she had this very carefully articulated and well-defended commitment to the things that you and I enjoy and talk about on this podcast.
I'm excited. Should we get to it?
Yeah, without further ado. Excellent. So this is David and my guest host here.
Yeah, this is Jeff. Very nice to meet you, Heather.
Hi, Jeff.
So we are just incredible fans of your work. I just have to say that at the beginning. And I've read your book, Are Cops Racist? I read that nearly a decade ago. And then just about a month ago, I think I read Diversity Delusion. And both of them were just marvelous examples of careful research, also incredible courage, I would say, in the kind of scholarship that you develop. And I know Jeff has read a number of your articles.
Yes, yeah. In this interview, Heather, we're hoping it's something, hopefully a little bit different for you from maybe a typical interview request that you get. And so, we're really interested, maybe not so much in you talking, specifically about, policing policy and a lot of the specifics of the stuff that you read on, but more so in kind of the philosophy behind it. And our podcast is a classics, Greco-Roman antiquity themed podcast. But we're also, very interested in kind of the state of the humanities writ large, and with you in particular, kind of your own kind of humanistic study, which we know that you have a long background in, and how that's affected kind of your ideas and your work and your life.
Well, this morning, I have to say, my experience this morning makes this discussion very relevant. I was going to my lovely outdoor pool complex at a high school here in Irvine, California. Somehow it came up, the guy that was overseeing entry into the facility mentioned that his stepfather, I guess he had asked me about what I did and why I was able to commute between New York and California. And I said, well, I'm a writer, and so I can work really wherever I am. And he said, what do you write on? I said, well, public policy matters. I sometimes write about policing and crime and identity politics. And he said, well, my stepfather also writes, but he does boring stuff. And his boring stuff was being a scholar of 18th century literature. And he's at King's College in London, and apparently he had just discovered a previously unknown play by a 16th century playwright. And I said to him, what are you talking about? Your stepfather has the greatest job in the entire world. He has the most important job as a curator of these great works. But, what I came up against was the popular conception that somehow the study of literature was marginal and not the main thing. Whereas for me, for much of, all of the first part of my life, that was the thing that I aspired most fervently to do. And I still don't think that there's any greater privilege than being involved in the study of the humanities.
Yeah.
So as a jumping off point, maybe, could you tell us a little bit about your autobiography in terms of your English studies at Yale and then additionally at Cambridge? Because those who know your work, which is frankly a large body of people, I was telling a near family member, I'm going to be interviewing Heather McDonald, and he immediately said, "Oh, I know who she is. I see her on television. I really like the things she has to say." but they may not know about your broader interests and some of the things we were just talking about. Would you be willing to share a little bit of that with our audience, the things that you studied in terms of English literature, before becoming well known as a scholar of social policy?
Sure. And I do so at the risk of befuddling your listeners, because what I'm about to describe really defies common sense. But I really am an academic monkey. As I say, that was what I was trying to do. I came to Yale in 1974, already fascinated by language, and I gravitated towards literary works that were most sort of rich and wild in their use of language, whether Melville, Moby Dick, or Virginia Woolf. And Yale turned out to be in the middle of a big ferment intellectually. It had been the source decades ago of a important style of reading known as New Criticism, which was a reaction against a very historical approach to books, which sort of didn't look very closely at what was actually on the page, but spent a lot of time putting an author in his historical context and maybe commenting on the moral qualities of a novel, but didn't really focus in on the specific words and structures that an author used. So Yale developed this form of reading known as close reading, such names as Cleonth Brooks, that said, look, if we're reading a poem, we really want to find out what that author is doing with language. And the history, the context, the political context is secondary if we're going to look at it at all. So that was the usual state of literary criticism at Yale. Again, very important movement. Mm-hmm. Well, when I got there, that paradigm was cracking apart. And Yale was the main recipient of a form of thinking and philosophy that was developing in Europe, in Paris, and in the United States, known as deconstruction or post-structuralism.
So this is where Derrida is starting to come into vogue?
Yep, this is the rise of Jacques Derrida, who would come and teach periodically at Yale, surrounded by a swarm of devoted, absolutely blind graduate students. And Yale's version of Derrida was Paul de Man, a true scholar of European literature, who had cut his chops on the English Romantics. But what these people proposed, it purported to be a theory of language. It purported to describe and reveal hidden facts about language that the deluded public was unaware of, which were such propositions. And this again, David and Jeff, is where I risk really losing your listeners because they're so counterfactual. The claim made by deconstruction, and remember, this is the literature department, was that language always breaks down. It is never successful because it's a set of arbitrary signs. Its meaning is unstable, inevitably ambiguous. We can never really get access to a speaker's intention. And literature, they claimed, is only about its own failure. It's self-referential. This is crazy. The reason people write novels until maybe recently with the height of postmodernism was to try to illuminate the human experience and to put into words insights into what motivates human beings that we would otherwise not have access to. To say that literature is about its own mode of representation is incredibly hermetic and simply wrong. But I was seduced by this because I was already, as I say, very interested in language, but not having ever studied linguistics. And this held out promises, this hidden sort of mystery cult of the initiated who possessed a knowledge that made them more enlightened and superior to those who read books thinking they were reading about moral dilemmas and human foibles. So I wasted my time at Yale studying Jacques Derrida, studying de Man, Lacan. Heidegger, one can be that he's a sort of a fence liar. There may be indeed valid points to him, and he certainly also foregrounded the relevance of language in creating human experience. And so instead of spending as much time reading actual books and novels and poetry, which I did do, and I'm grateful for that, I also spent way too much time struggling with these theoretical texts, which were incredibly clotted in their language, and just ended up recycling a set of empty rhetorical gestures that had no reference to the real world. That was just, it became more and more mannered and arcane. But I will say this, the one advantage of my time being at Yale, and I was there from 74 to 78, was amazingly, identity politics had not hit, multiculturalism had not hit. Nobody thought to complain that English 25, the gateway course for English majors, contained only dead white males. I was privileged to read Chaucer, Spencer, Milton, Pope, Wordsworth, Wallace Stevens, without anyone pouring the poison into my ear of thinking that I was being deprived or somehow oppressed because I was not reading females. There was, of course, plenty of opportunity to read females, and I did go forward and read Edith Wharton and George Eliot, which, I think Middlemarch is perhaps the greatest novel ever written, Virginia Woolf. But that didn't happen. So I emerged from that far too ignorant about literature as from what I should have been as an English major, went on to Cambridge to continue studying English lit and focused there on Renaissance literature, focused on Ben Jonson's Court Masques, which are very wonderful pieces of literary artifice and full of gorgeous, ripe language. But I also studied linguistics, and that started my separation from deconstruction. I fell in love with speech act theory, which is sort of the opposite of deconstruction because it's all about what we can do with words, as the great work by J.L. Austin said, how to do things with words, and was about language as action, as things that change the world. I went back to Yale because Yale was still the summit. If you wanted to be a literary scholar, and I was going to be a professor of comparative literature, I picked up German and Italian. I already knew French, and I picked up some Spanish. Yale was the place to be because of the reign of high theory. When I returned in '80, after 2 years of study at Cambridge, I went back. I sat in, I took Paul de Mont's courses, and I was appalled. I heard him saying things that he had been repeating when I was there. Nothing had changed, and to now my ears, they struck me as absolute lunacy. De Mont in particular, he had gone in this very bizarre direction where his writing about Shelley, for instance, was obsessed with images of mutilation, decapitation, truly just grotesque, weird, violent imagery. And I realized that Yale was stuck in a discourse that was completely inadequate to the greatness of literature. So this was for me a real sort of an intellectual crisis because I had revered these people. I aspired. Right. I revered my professors. I fell in love with all of them because they were the source of knowledge, sometimes real knowledge, sometimes specious knowledge. And I realized I couldn't go forward. So I left. I piddled around for a bit. I eventually went to law school because I was still interested in high theory and I was interested in legal hermeneutics, the same problems of how you read text, how you interpret language. I realized came up in constitutional interpretation. So I went to law school just in order to continue studying issues of language and reading, but in a non-literature context, which meant that I was blind to the fact that law was actually about solving practical problems. And eventually after that, I clerked for a very left-wing judge, but I didn't aspire to be a lawyer, and I didn't become one really. And I came out of that period sort of angry about my wasted college education, and I aspired to write the definitive refutation of deconstruction. And I would hang out at the St. Mark's bookstore in New York off of Astor Place, subjecting myself to the continuing reign of high theory and just getting madder and madder. And I created all these note cards that I was going to do the definitive refutation. Well, I never wrote that, but I did start writing about other issues. By then, multiculturalism had completely destroyed the study of literature by injecting race and gender obsessions into the study of literature, which is far worse than anything deconstruction really did. So I started writing for magazines like Salmagundi and Partisan Review on multiculturalism, postmodernism, and eventually was pushed to start doing real reporting in public policy, which is something I had no background in. And then that from there I went on. But as I say, my heart lies with the humanities. I still believe that being a university professor is the greatest job one could ever have if the universities hadn't been completely corrupted.
Yeah, well, that's fascinating, Heather. Thank you. This is David. So I wanted to go back to something that you said, which stuck out, and I want to test out a little bit of a simile here and see what you think. You said that the literature as it was presented to you as an undergraduate was really not about the content, about the communication of human meaning, but literature was really about its own demise. So that seems to me akin to the study of painting being reduced to the fact that the canvases will eventually corrode and the brushes will eventually fall apart, that sort of thing. And in distinction to that, we have Quintilian, right, the great Roman orator, who says that all communication is docere delectare movere. It's teaching, it's gratifying, and it's persuading. So my question for you, as you experienced this literary journey, is why would individuals even want to read literature if it affords no pleasure whatsoever? Or what kinds of pleasures can they get from a narrative which is really about the worthlessness or weakness of the literature that you're reading? Is that a question you've thought about at all, or what motivates such people? Is it just power?
Well, I can speak from personal experience, and because it was power, but I don't mean that in this case in a negative or condescending way. It felt like power because you were seeing, it's like a mystery cult, the Delphic mysteries, that you were seeing something that the rest of the public could not see, and you were learning a hidden dangerous truth. I'm not a Straussian, and it's been described, the way it's been described to me, it's always very puzzling. And as I understand it, they keep talking about, and I think Alan Bloom was in that school, that there are these mystery knowledge, hidden knowledge or hidden wisdom in the classics, above all the Greek literature, that the public is not privy to. And I've never had anybody tell me, well, what exactly are those mysteries? But in this case, the mystery is that, as I say, language always fails. And it felt like you were part of the cutting edge, and there was something inebriating to that. I am so ashamed that there were classmates of mine who were wise enough to reject this stuff, and they thought that it was just insane. I was so sort of, self-centered or narrow in my mind that I regarded those early seers with a certain degree of condescension, because I thought, well, you just don't understand. This is really important. Now I regard them as preternaturally wise to have been able to reject something that, yes, you're absolutely right, David, does, when you step back, say, well, why should we bother? Demond would read the same passage of Proust again and again, and I'm going again into the arcana of deconstruction, but one of the gestures was always to reduce metaphor to metonymy. And I'm not going to go say beyond that why that's significant, but he would do the same rhetorical deconstruction on every text, and it was just repetitive. But it served as a source of specialized knowledge. And now I think there is, again, a sense of this being a mystery cult, and the people that are involved in it are in their own world. I sometimes ask myself, if I had never had my demystifying moment, and I was demystified with regards to deconstruction, the way deconstruction purports to be demystified when it comes to literature and illusions of meaning, if I had stayed in that world, and I would have been successful, I was a very successful student, and I'd lived always within that delusion, would I have been just as happy? I mean, it's like Plato's cave. If you never turn around and see that you're just in the realm of shadows, and you live in a world that rewards your effort, does it matter if you're living in error for all of your life, if you're in a context that supports that error? And I think it's better to live with truth, but many people go through their careers and nothing ever challenges them, and maybe they're just as happy as we are. I don't know.
Yeah, that's great. That's fantastic. I wonder if we can just go back to your biography for a moment. And so as you say, you were as a young student kind of seduced by this stuff, but came to kind of have a very kind of polar opposite view. Was there was it your time at Cambridge? Was there kind of an aha moment? Was there a text that you read where you just kind of said, this is nonsense? Or was it more kind of a gradual awakening away from deconstruction?
Well, no, it really was linguistics. I realized this is the real study of language. I was fascinated by syntax. We did Chomsky. I was fascinated by phonetics. It is rigorous. These are people that are actually struggling to understand the forms of language. And as I say, speech act theory, not just Austin, but also John Searle, I just found it really mesmerizing. So it was coming back to Yale with that exposure that did provoke this crisis. But I don't want to say that my education was utterly deficient in reading literature. And I will just say this, knowing that this is a classics course, I feel, rather podcast, classics-based podcast, I was privileged to take a course by Thomas Gould in Greek tragedy and comedy. And he was, there were still professors there that had not gone whole hog into high theory. And everybody felt maybe a little bit of a need, except the German department, God bless it, I think was the last holdout. Now, of course, it's gone completely all in. But Gould was just able to convey the terror of these tragedies, the oddness, the weirdness, the strangeness of the Greek chorus and the Oresteia and the movement on the stage of, back and forth with the odes and the counter odes and the masking and the dancing and the singing. And it's utterly a hair-raising spectacle to think about. And, the Oresteia with its just exploration of absolutely primal forces of human beings that civilized society appears today to have forgotten about, even though that we're unleashing them by the day. We are unleashing the furies. We are unleashing the bloodlust that, when you break down Law and Order, that the Oresteia shows us was hard fought and hard won. People returned to a savage state. So that was for me one of the seminal courses. But so I was able to do that, and Tom Green, Renaissance literature, he was very much on the fence, trying to introduce some degree of deconstructive awareness about problems of literary representation, but nevertheless was a very traditional, deeply read scholar. John Fricero, I took the Divine Comedy from. Gorgeous, beautiful man, went on to teach at Stanford, but he was probably the most involved in literary theory of the more traditional scholars, but was able to nevertheless bring forth his deep knowledge of medieval literature. I will say this, that one real problem with the new criticism, which is again reading to just look very closely at the text and not be so concerned with context, is that context, historical context, it turns out does matter. And so I struggled with Paradise Lost in my freshman year. I remember breaking down in tears because I could not handle Milton's syntax initially. I mean, it is so Latinate, and it defeated me initially. And I eventually broke through and ended up just adoring the richness of his language, his description of paradise. But the idea of me reading Paradise Lost is actually ludicrous, because I knew nothing about the theological debates then, about the history of 17th century England at that point. And so the new criticism creates an illusion as well that literature exists in this timeless realm, where it does not. It is often deeply informed by what's going on. And so you have to find some kind of balance between a focus too much simply on context that doesn't pay attention to the words on the page, and then paying attention to the words on the page to the exclusivity of understanding other things that authors may have been responding to that are outside the literary text. And, Roland Barthes famously said, "Il n'y a rien dehors le texte." There's nothing outside of the text. Well, that's just ridiculous. Of course there is, but that is the assumption of deconstruction.
Right. Yeah, that idea that it kind of gets back to things you were saying, and David's question is, at the end of the day, if you follow that path, what's the point? If you can't say anything that's grounded in something that's lasting or eternal, why bother doing it in the first place? As a teacher and as a scholar myself, I mean, that this idea that understanding the context of which produced a text, or this idea that it doesn't matter, the death of the author, it never made any sense to me. It always struck me as so nonsensical. And to look at a text in its context struck me as such commonsensical. That what you're saying really resonates with me. Yeah.
So again, you have to give them the benefit of the doubt. They think they are involved in truth, and but of course, what was often pointed out is that Damon or even somebody in critical legal studies is going to sign a contract. I mean, they actually live as if language means things and that we can share stable meanings. So there is a contradiction between their view of the utter breakdown of meaning and how they go about leading their lives and presumably talking with their family members and whatnot. But they would say, and I also am not going to use the word nihilism because I think conservatives overuse that, but they would say that they are involved in the pursuit of truth, and that they are strong enough to look upon a troubling reality and look it in its face, sort of like the Gorgon head.
Lovely reference there, Heather. That's really excellent.
But would you also say that they someone like Demand would say that I'm pursuing truth, but I also recognize that in 10 years' time my work will be completely meaningless because truth will have changed.
Yeah, I don't know if they said that. That's interesting. I bet you they didn't think that. But I'll tell you this, David and Jeff, deconstruction went enough into my bloodstream before antibodies that I actually am not a believer in eternal truth. I guess I'm a sort of a pragmatist where I don't think, and I also don't think there is a single meaning of text. I don't see how anybody in the literary field who has seen the number of interpretations that any given poem or play can generate can actually believe that there's one single meaning there.
Sure.
And so I do think that it just is, to me, it's empirically obvious that language does spin off a number of meanings, and people respond to language very differently. I mean, it's very frustrating often. I don't particularly enjoy reading groups because one's own sense of what the text is about is shaken by everybody else who has completely different views.
Right.
So how can you insist on a single meaning? That entails a certain amount of narcissism, because it's always going to be I'll believe in like truth when somebody says, well, you have the right meaning, I don't. And that never happens.
No, it's quite often the opposite.
This episode of Ad Nauseam is brought to you by Hackett Publishing. Jeff, what is one thing you like about Hackett?
I love their covers. I've said it many times, but I'm going to keep saying it. The cover of the Bacchae with Elvis Presley on the front, the cover of the Iliad with the troops landing at D-Day. I love these really clever correlations of contemporary or near contemporary events with antiquity. That's one of my favorite things is when we can thread those things together.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. It's what we do here, right?
Yeah.
As we are ambigoners, we try to attach literature and so forth to contemporary items.
That's
but
right.
Back to Hackett.
Yes.
For more than 40 years, they have been bringing high quality, inexpensive, attractive materials to the masses.
Yep. When I first started reading Hackett, it was as a student in my grad school days, I believe. And once I had my own classroom, I knew that was going to be a go-to for me. And every year in my classes, I order Hackett publications, and I have a lot of them on my shelf at home too.
Absolutely. True story.
Yep.
True story. I'm teaching a course this semester, Bonaventure, his Journey of the Mind Toward God, also Boethius, Consolation of Philosophy. And I thought, I wonder if Hackett has anything about that. Silly question, right?
Yes, right. Of course they do.
Does Hackett have it? So I looked it up. Boethius, Consolatio Nat Philosophiae. They got it. So I contacted them, and a copy is on its way.
Excellent.
So fantastic.
Deep catalog.
Correct. Fantastic customer service, deep catalog. Jeff, how can our listeners get some of this goodness?
If they go to hackettpublishing.com, they find the text they want, they put them in their little grocery basket, and they type in the code AN2021. They will get 20% off their order and free shipping.
That's incredible. I love the way you snuck the grocery basket in there.
I tried to slip that past you.
Squeaky wheel.
Dave, this podcast is also brought to us by the Moss Method. Will you tell us something about the Moss Method?
Well, of course I will. Office hours.
This is the big new thing, right?
Yes. For weeks now, we have been meeting for Moss office hours. On Friday, typically, we meet for an hour. Anyone who is enrolled in the course gets to spend an hour with me. It's not as great as it sounds. Maybe it doesn't sound great at all.
Yeah.
I have to spend every waking minute with myself. Back to the subject, right?
Yeah. But what are they talking about? What are you guys learning?
Well, we're talking about Greek.
Oh, Greek. Okay.
So we cover classical subjects. You've got a question about Homer, as students tend to do. You have a New Testament subject. We've looked at the Gospel of Mark. We've looked at Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, other places. Or if you have a Moss-related question for those who are working their way through the text. So the program is self-paced, expert, and accessible. The office hours are the accessible part.
Nice.
And then after each little office hour, I excerpt a tiny lesson. I put it out there to the masses. They can see it. They can understand. This is the way to take my Greek from neophyte
to erudite.
Exactly. So go to mossmethod.com and click on the link. It's a $299 value. We run sales throughout the year, but you're not going to want to miss this opportunity to elevate your study of the Greek language.
Check it out. This episode of Ad Nauseam also brought to you by Ratio Coffee. Ratio Coffee, coming from our friends way out there on the West Coast, it is Portland, right? And they have created a machine that will deliver high-quality brew right in your home. No need to go down to the local coffee shop. Ratio Coffee has found the secret to great coffee at an affordable price.
Absolutely. Solves all of our brew-based aesthetic problems.
That's right. You got the ratio 8.
I do have the ratio 8. Now, I had a little trouble this week.
Oh, no.
Yes, I ran out of filters.
Oh, no.
Yeah, so I usually use the metal one, but it got a little clogged. And as I was cleaning it, not a ratio product, I went generic on the filter. But
yeah.
Anyway, while I was waiting for the filters to arrive, I had to drink some inferior coffee.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, it was like a catabasis, let me tell you. I went down into the bad coffee and barely escaped with my soul intact.
You return never quite the same.
Never quite the same.
You can never go home again.
The brackish tang hung around me, thick in the air.
Yeah. I have a similar kind of, it's not as dark as that.
Okay.
Today, after class, a student came up to me and said, "Hey, I work at this coffee shop whose
Right.
name you would recognize.
Okay, don't name it.
I won't. And she handed me a coupon for a free beverage. She said, Professor Winkle, would you like this? And so I smiled and I said, yeah. I said,
That was
thank
so
you very
kind
much.
of you. And then you turned around.
And I'm thinking, what am I going to do with this? It's going to be a letdown.
Right.
Yeah.
You turned around and tossed it in the trash, I'm guessing. Speaking of coupons,
Yes?
great segue, Winkle.
Yeah.
Big announcement, right?
Right.
Not only the Ratio 6 at 15% off, right? What's that code?
That is ANCO.
Yes, ANCO. But Mark has arranged a special coupon, ANCO. You can now get 15% off the Ratio 8.
That is now available.
Yes, because the 8, as you know, has been out of stock because it's such a beautiful machine.
It is.
It's back in stock, and you, Ad Nauseam listener, you want to get the Ratio 8, enter the same coupon code ANCO, get 15% off.
I want to keep some stats here, like how many people buy the 8 versus the 6. I think we can gauge it as like, who do they like better, you or me?
Well, we all know who they like better. You're the good cop. I'm the bad cop. I'm the pedantic, glass mostly empty. You're the optimistic, glass overflowing kind of guy.
Okay, I'll buy that.
So I'd like to veer into the political just for a moment here, and that is when you were talking about your experience of the Greek tragedy and comedy class, and you were talking about the limitations and the fine line between order and chaos, and you started talking a little bit about the furies and so forth that have been unleashed. It's a two-part question. Do you remember which of those tragedies spoke to you most and why? And then secondly, in our correspondence, we talked briefly about the concept of Hellenic pessimism, which seems like it's an idea that's very salient to a lot of your work, that people complain about the excesses of policing. They complain, the supposed excesses. They complain about the many small and some great injustices in society, but they seldom contemplate the alternative. What if some of these provisions were taken away? Then we would see the real breakdown of society and people just getting stomped on in various settings. So it's a two-part question. Take it however you want, or ignore it altogether.
I think the Oresteia for me really was the sort of the most shook me to my core, but I also adored the Bacchae by Euripides rather, and,
Right.
and the sense there again of this power of madness, of delusion, the cross-dressing I find fascinating. I've always been mesmerized by transvestites and the blending of the male and female characteristics in one person. There's a beauty there that combines the male and the female that I find just utterly hypnotic. And so the Bacchae is just that the plot is just so extraordinarily devilish and cruel, but also full of surprises and amazing kind of insights into human delusion. So that was also very important. And I loved Aristophanes, but I can't think off the top of my head of
Right.
any of those. But the comedies were fantastic.
Sure.
As far as Hellenic pessimism, yeah, I mean, that's sort of a conservative trope, taking it aside from the Hellenic part, that it's said that conservatives kind of don't believe in progress and they believe in human nature. And I would agree with that and I would subscribe to that, but then I think that doesn't really match with the sort of Reagan-esque optimism. So I'm not sure that's quite true, but I definitely do think, and I think we have made progress. I think that the Enlightenment was progress morally. I think the ideas of tolerance, of secularism, have taken us away from at least the brutal wars of religion. So I think that, and to say we don't progress on a material basis is, of course, patently absurd. But yes, I guess I would say that there is just a constant desire on the part of human beings that will never change for power. Once you have power, you abuse it. Americans are clueless about this trajectory that we're on where we wonder when do we pull the emergency cord and say we are heading towards some kind of Stalinist totalitarian state. We think that somehow, well, I think people are just simply ignorant but to the extent they think about it at all, they must assume there's something in America's DNA that will prevent the seizure of state power to crush dissent, to crush freedom of speech. But we're moving there quite quickly. And as far as the sheer violence, that's going on in every inner city neighborhood in the country today, with these mad drive-by shootings that are the most barbaric acts imaginable. And when you remove law and order, when you remove the justified and constitutionally restrained power of the state to enforce norms, you do unleash the thirst for revenge, the tit for tat killings that we see that is driving the inner city. It is right out of the Aristaya, it's one blood cycle after another. Right. And people, it's not like they're taking justice into their own hands in the inner city because they don't believe in justice. They're just wanting to kill their enemies. But we do have to hand over the power of justice to the state, I think, in order to live in a civil society.
And Jeff, thank you very much, Heather, for that answer. And Jeff, you were interested in asking Heather, as we were doing our research for this episode, about the time she spent in Italy, studying in Italy.
Yes, yeah, Heather. If Wikipedia can be believed, it says you spent some time in Italy studying, and I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that time again. Back to these core questions, how that shaped you in your own study, in your own thought.
Well, I was just there. I was at Perugia at the Università per Stranieri learning Italian. So I was not studying Italian art or literature, but I hung out with a bunch of students from then Yugoslavia because unlike other American students who I have to say I feel contempt for, that inevitably blanket themselves with other Americans, they go on school year abroad, so they go to language programs and they speak English the whole time.
Right.
I was determined to get my Italian up to speed, and the Yugoslav students were just so kind and wonderful. So we all spoke Italian together. And I did visit a lot of the Umbrian hill towns. There was a young art history Italian student there who took me around to San Sepolcro and Arezzo. And so I certainly saw a lot of the Renaissance art, but I was doing the language course, which was not particularly rigorous. I had learned German at Middlebury, and at that point, that was, if you wanted to learn a language quickly, that was the place to be. Since then, it's gone way soft and doesn't require people to go to language labs and repeat because, that would be just too boring and, too masculinist or whatever. But at the time, it was sheer rote repetition, ringing changes on grammatical structures, and it drove German into my head. The Italian the study at Perugia was much more sort of relaxed and whatnot. So I don't feel like I have as strong a grounding in grammar as I do for German, but so that's why I was there. I wish I could say that I was there to study Bernini, but I wasn't.
Gotcha. Yeah. Do you have any Latin in your background? Did you study?
No,
Latin?
It's the weirdest thing. I found it on Latin. I didn't take it up until senior year of college. And I'd had no problem with German with its case structure, but for some reason, I just couldn't make it with Latin. In Cambridge, I continued. We tried to read book 4 of the Aeneid, and I just never felt what made Virgil great. I was struggling too much. I was struggling too much to connect the syntax.
Well, you don't have to name names. I'm not looking for that, but I have found that for certain disciplines, the quality of the teacher makes all the difference. I mean, a student can certainly be stubborn to the learning of a subject, and a good teacher will make no headway. But a student who's interested and, has some basic to positive intelligence, a good teacher can really ignite that passion. So it makes me a little bit sad that book 4 of the Aeneid
I know.
didn't speak to you. It's got
I don't know. I don't even really remember my Latin teacher at Yale, but I had Wheelock. I mean, I don't remember thinking that the teacher was deficient in any way. It may be for me. It helps to have the oral capacity as well.
Oh.
I don't know, but
well, there's a renaissance in the United States and actually worldwide of spoken Latin. It's something that, of which I'm a practitioner. I'm not one of the better ones, but I happen to know a lot of individuals who attempt to use Latin as a living language, and some of them are extraordinarily fluent. So perhaps maybe, after your, 15th, 16th book, you can take some time and I particularly loved in the Diversity Delusion, your most recent work. I read it about a month ago. I loved the references to Petrarch that you dropped in, where Petrarch is, some people say Petrarch, he's writing letters to the ancients, and you use that as a point of contrast, I think, to how the study of literature used to be connecting us to the world's larger questions and just the beauty of human expression and communication. I thought that was an excellent contrast, and so that's when I thought we should see if Heather will be a guest on our podcast, because we speak the same language in some ways.
Yeah, well, they were. It's not just that the letters to the ancients by Petrarch connected to the larger world, it's that he felt so close a connection to the authors he read. And so he could rebuke Cicero for his seeming mean-spiritedness as revealed in some of Cicero's own writings.
Right.
And then Petrarch felt bad about rebuking him and wrote him another letter saying, well, please don't think I'm really mad at you or anything like that, because you are, after all, my God. But that degree of deep connection with authors and being able to lose oneself in their language is something that has been lost with identity politics. And it is an opportunity. Literature should be an opportunity to get out of yourself. I am just so ignorant. I'm so narrow in my concerns. And my only hope for escaping the binding quality of my own limited awareness or experience is through art and literature, but also music and painting. And now there's just this narcissism that's taken over, where students insist on virtually studying themselves. If they don't see themselves reflected in a text, they don't feel like there's any point in reading that book. And that's just, as far as I'm concerned, just the most perverse and ignorant way to approach the past. And, I'm also very grateful. I was thinking about this recently. This weekend, I was with a very charming younger woman who's actually sort of involved in overseeing the college scene, but it's quite clear she has not had a humanistic education. We were at an event that involved sort of the art history in America, and she never had heard of Edward Hopper. And I'm very grateful that I did do art history, that my mind, although I don't know much history, I do have a good sense of stylistic evolution, both in the visual arts, in music, and in literature. And so, especially for art history, I think it gives you a map to think about the evolution of human style. I've written, I think there's no greater drama than the evolution of style, whether it's in language or literature or art. It's just extraordinary, the changes that have been wrought in literary form. And how do we go from the medieval epic romance to the 19th century realistic novel? What sort of changes were involved in how human beings thought about themselves and expressed themselves to go from one to the other? It's a stunning, absolutely dramatic, revolutionary change. But to be able to sort of situate, Ancien Regime painting in my head and compare that to turn of the 19th century to the Napoleonic era of painting, and then later as you get the neoclassicism evolving into more of the Beaux-Arts style, and then obviously the counter revolution, or the revolution against it with Impressionism, or going back further to Renaissance into the Baroque, that gives you a place in the world. And I ask myself, what is it like to be a young person today who also, like me, knows very little history, but has been not exposed at all to the history of arts? Like, what's in their head instead? I guess it's just Instagram or something.
I do think it's largely pop culture.
It's an emptiness, right. And that's tragic. It's tragic because I don't purport to be a scholar of anything. And you could say, somebody who's an expert in porcelain could say, well, you're missing out a lot because you can't tell the change over 50 years in the factory in Belgium that was making porcelain. You don't know that stylistic evolution. So there's always somebody who can one-up you in knowledge. But I feel I'm grateful for the knowledge I do have. And I just think it's absolutely horrifying that the university and the K through 12 system has given up on trying to populate the imaginations of students with a sense of the past, both historical and art historical.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I found that when I do teach, Western civ surveys, where we're doing lots of literature, lots of art, trying to find a kind of a common language, a common ground, is almost impossible. Even when we do some lighter stuff in class, we do look at parodies, or showing students a parody of the Beatles' Abbey Road album cover, and they have no idea what this is about, or a parody of the Arnolfini portrait. Moore will get something in there that's riffing on Da Vinci's Last Supper, but that kind of that common language, that common grounding in just to we're talking maybe art historical grounding, it's just not there anymore, and it just kind of adds to kind of this fragmented nature of sort of the students that come into my classroom.
Yeah, it's utterly tragic. And It's not just that we don't share a common language. So that's kind of a utilitarian argument that we need something to hold us together. And Edie Hirsch has been very good about the need for a common core. And I use that term. I know there's a lot of dispute over the current common core, which is really, I think that's, so far as I understand it, a misnomer, because it does not teach the classics. It goes instead for like a lot of nonfiction and excerpts and whatnot. But Hirsch talked about the need for a common language of the past and great works. But I also feel like, for me, I refuse utilitarian arguments. I refuse to say, somebody sent me recently a little music program that he was very proud of in his parish church in Connecticut, that was going to try and go into the schools and give students some rudiments of classical music. But of course, it ended with the usual just pandering. Well, of course, the study of music helps people cognitively and socially and blah, blah, blah. BS. No, the study of music exposes you to beauty. That is an end in itself. And that is true for literature and art as well. And Absolutely. The reason to study these works is to keep them alive. If we do not study them, they die, at least temporarily. They at least go into cold storage until somebody awakens them with a kiss of Eros again. And it is on us, it is on our shoulders to keep these works that we don't deserve alive. And that's the problem. It's not just that we don't have a common base of reference, because in fact, they do have a common base of reference. Now, it's shallower and shallower, and who knows what the span is at 5 years. It's obviously, if it doesn't go back to the Beatles, that's pretty shallow, but they speak a common language. But the problem is that we have turned our backs on the greatness of the past.
Right. So there's an aesthetic selectivity, I would say, that's completely inconsistent. When I get the pragmatic argument from my students and others that I interact with, they say, well, you teach Latin, but what use is that, right? And I say, well, it's beautiful, kind of like a Haydn piano sonata is beautiful, but people don't apply their aesthetic principles consistently. I ask them, why do you paint your house a certain color? Why do you care what your food tastes like? How come you wear different, colored shirts? And, maybe Mark Zuckerberg doesn't. He wears only the gray hoodie. But why do you bother with all of these things when they're really just aesthetic choices? They have nothing to do with the functionality of the rest of your life. But in the arts, suddenly a novel or a piece of music has to justify its existence. It doesn't make sense.
Interesting. Yep, that's absolutely right. And I hate that argument. And I gave a speech at the Manhattan Institute making the case for the humanities, and a youngish middle-aged man stood up and he was very waspy. I mean, he looked like he came from a New England family, very tall and slender, and one could imagine him having had a fairly classical education, because one imagined him going to prep schools. But he made the argument, well, how does this help my student get a job? And I guess I would preserve some part of education for people who maybe don't need to worry about that right away, that want to devote themselves to the classics and to the study of literature, without always thinking about, does this translate into a consulting gig at McKinsey or Bain or whatnot? And
right,
one can make the argument that, well, it turns out that a humanities or a history background, you learn critical thinking, which is a term that just makes you want to vomit. I mean, that's the thing that students do not learn. But again, what we need is substance, not structure. We need substantive content knowledge. But if it meant that college was for fewer people, that would be a good thing as far as I'm concerned. But so for this reason, I was very much opposed. The Donald Trump administration under Betsy DeVos they inherited a system of evaluating colleges based on the salaries of their graduates.
Right.
And DeVos took it one step further and wanted to start evaluating majors based on the salaries of their graduates. And I thought this was disastrous because it just encourages people all the more to think of college as simply a place for, boosting one's economic value in the marketplace. And I may just be protected and privileged to think that for some people, at least, it should be a 4-year hiatus from the marketplace to just be able to absorb our past.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. 2 quick points, Jeff, and then you have a question, I think.
I do.
First is, I'm really satisfied that we got Heather to say on the Ad Nauseam podcast that something makes her want to vomit. Did you catch that?
That wasn't the setup. I'm so sorry. You didn't ring a bell or anything. I don't.
No.
We're going to use that. That's going to be a clip.
Of course. And the second point is, it strikes me as very ironic that most of the individuals, there are some exceptions, Haydn had a nice sinecure, but most of the individuals who in the course of history have produced the greatest art, many of them have been mostly unemployed and, driven in circumstances of poverty, like Solzhenitsyn grinding out his existence in the Gulag. Meanwhile, he's preparing to write one of the greatest novels of the 20th century. So pragmatism didn't apply to the creators of these great works of art. So, why should it apply to the consumers? But
Yeah.
I digress. Go ahead, Jeff.
A couple of things that made me really excited. You talk about Euripides Bacchae, which is my all-time favorite Greek tragedy, and you also mentioned Edward Hopper, who is my favorite American artist. And I think there's a link. If I can stretch it, like there's a link between them. I find both Hopper and Euripides haunting and lonely and disturbing in their own ways, in the way that they hit you. But my question is to get back to what we were talking about with kind of this this pragmatic view of education, and I'm just kind of curious what your take is. Kind of where do you think that comes from? Is it just kind of an American pragmatism that kind of fights against that beauty for beauty's sake? Is it just kind of the waves of culture as we're experiencing them now? I don't know if you're familiar with Heath and Hanson's book that came out in the 1990s, Who Killed Homer? And their answer is, a couple of classicists, Victor Davis Hanson and John Heath, their answer to that question was, who killed Homer? Classicists killed Homer. So where is kind of this devaluing of the humanities come from? Is it just kind of this American pragmatism, or is it, getting back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this podcast, is it the professors themselves strangled it?
I think it's absolutely both. And I think you're absolutely right, Jeff, that there is an American pragmatism. I think we've always been more vocational oriented. De Tocqueville and other European observers came to the United States and they said, God, all these people care about is making money. And, they work all the time and it's all they think about. And we didn't have, and you say that, well, a lot of artists were starving. That's true. But they did aspire to court sponsorship, but a lot of art was produced by aristocratic patrons, and I am not compelled to apologize for that in the least. I think that the aristocracy had notions of grandeur and nobility and greatness that were very rarely lived up to, but nevertheless did inspire an artistic style, above all the Baroque, that I think is absolutely uplifting and some of the greatest expressions of the human spirit. And America didn't come out of that tradition. And so in one sense, we were kind of borrowing that legacy, but we did borrow it. But there's always been these sort of debates about democratic elitism. Can we have, museums were for the people? To what extent is that legacy of high art and culture compatible? How deeply should it spread within the social classes and various utopian visions that completely and then other people may have been a little less involved with that. But what's interesting is that nevertheless our education system until quite well into the 19th century still was absolutely based in the classics. There was a debate at Yale. I thought the canned story is that it was the start of the German Research University in the 1870s, and Johns Hopkins picking that up, that said, no, universities are about the generation of new knowledge, above all in the sciences. And that gave rise to our idea of research university, and gave rise to the awful idea at Harvard of students having electives and being able to choose their own curriculum, which is the beginning of the end. But even back in the 1820s, there was this debate at Yale about whether to dislodge the study of Greek and Latin from the absolute core of the undergraduate education. So these currents of saying this is outdated and not practical enough were set in much earlier than I had previously understood. Yale in the 1820s decided, no, this is still the center. We're not going to do this. And, we all think of John Stuart Mill as being all about debate. He's been invoked by, during our free speech wars on campuses, standing for the proposition of, well, we need a debate of opinion on campuses, which I think is a fallacious ideal. It's not about debate. It's not about opinion. It's about knowledge. But he gave a speech as the head of St. Andrews University in Glasgow. He was Protestant, that also said, no, the core of education is Greek and Latin. And it's about absorbing knowledge. It's not about debate. So that was an ideal that we did hold on to for some time. As far as the classicists killing the classics, I haven't read Hanson's book, but so when you said it was from the 90s, so they were already taking up this trope about classics being just an outpost of white supremacy, because that's certainly reached an absolute din of complaint recently with the guy at Harvard, Daniel Peralta.
Princeton.
Yeah,
right.
Princeton, sorry.
Yeah.
No, so the book doesn't. The book is actually against that proposition. It's
of course it is, but was that already happening? The attempt to reduce classics to see it through a racial lens was already back in the 90s.
It was. Hanson and Heath were in the book are more reacting to theory
Definitely.
kind of postmodern just deconstruction of theory as what's kind of devaluing the
right.
classics.
The
yes.
unholy trinity, right, of race, class, and gender.
Right.
For sure. Well, we want to be respectful of your time, Heather, but this has been a wonderful conversation. If you had prophetic powers, this is my last question for you. I'll try to set up the question a little bit. What do you think about the prospects for the survival in American culture in the 21st century of these things that we love and appreciate? The Bacchae, Haydn, Mozart, even the Aeneid Book 4, which some are lukewarm to.
Not lukewarm, just not equal to. I'm not equal to.
I'm just teasing.
So Periclean Athens, right? A small society, highly aristocratic, and produced works that will last the test of time. Same for Florence under the Medici. So it only takes a very small number of people, I suppose, with committed supporters to keep these important things alive. If you were a prophetess, what do you think? What does it look like for the future?
Well, I am a Hellenic pessimist. I'm by nature a pessimist, so I have to take all of my views with a grain of salt, because I know that there's people that are constitutional optimists, and they would, it's the glass half full, glass half empty thing. And so I tend to be pretty dark about evaluating my present, and that carries into the future, because I've not seen anything improve in the way we think about our past or the greatness of art since the 1980s. I've not seen any improvement. Nevertheless, you do mention kind of the idea of small loci of culture. And so that is the challenge. Can we create institutions that will preserve these works, that will have enough prestige in the wider culture to be populated? Will parents be willing to send, if we could create a school that would be just forthrightly elitist in its choice of literature? I guess I'm not very familiar with the St. John's campuses, but I certainly support the idea in theory of a mandated great works curriculum. Can we create institutions that will be prestigious enough to get over the problem of status-obsessed parents who only care about credentializing their child with as prestigious a degree as they can get? So people are thinking about it. There's some efforts. There's this Ralston College that is starting in the South with Stephen Blackwood that is starting with the master's, but aspires to be a more traditional education. So it's certainly imperative, and I would just hope that some philanthropists would stop thinking that the only thing they need to support is centers to study capitalism and free markets, which are obviously important, but they would devote some of their philanthropic giving to the pure, unpragmatic art for its own sake.
Indeed. Hear, hear.
Wonderfully said.
Yes.
We try something brand new for the first time. Do you have any questions for us, Heather?
Well, what is your views on the future? I know that David, his own classics department was dismantled. So what do you think? What do you think the solution is going to be?
Right. Well, it's very kind of you to ask. I think that the classics will absolutely survive and will indeed thrive, and in fact may do better if unhooked from some of the pragmatism that drives institutions of higher education. May survive better outside the academy, but it will take individuals, like you were saying, who will put their philanthropic support behind it, and also who will unapologetically make the non-pragmatic and aesthetic arguments that we've been talking about. So I'm by nature quite pessimistic also, as Jeff can tell you. Yeah. But that's how I see it. What do you think, Jeff?
I'm the more the optimist of the two of us, and I think with regard to this question, I'm cautiously optimistic, although I wouldn't make any prediction about kind of where things are ultimately going. I mean, I just know that when I students come into my mythology class or into my my art survey classes, and the vast majority are coming in because they've been required to take this as a core requirement, and they have no real desire to be there, and then to watch them come alive, and they see I love this stuff. It really turns them on, and it really lights a fire. Now, whether that leads them to study it further in some regard, in many cases I have no idea. But I see it on their faces, and I hear it in their questions, and it's enlivening. And if students get a chance to encounter this stuff, they walk away the better for it.
Well, the problem is, we need graduates departments to turn out more students like you, David and Jeff, and that's not happening now. And and you, David and Jeff, would not get hired now. So unless you've got some features that I don't know about that make it a little bit intersectional, it's kind of hopeless. But
I could mow your lawn maybe, or wash your car.
Oh, way too masculine.
Oh man!
Well, thank you so much, Heather. This has been an absolute delight. You're as charming viva voce as on the page. So thank you for giving us your time.
Thank you so much.
Well, it's an honor to be with you. Thank you so much, and I look forward to being in further contact with you guys.
Oh, thank
Sounds
you so
great.
much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, that wraps it up. That was great.
What an episode,
What an episode. Yeah, what a mind.
Yeah,
right?
I think we probably had more fun with that than the listener ever could.
Probably, yeah. So big thanks to Heather for joining us, and can't say thanks enough.
Yes, and if you haven't followed her on social media, read some of her books, by all means, check it out. You don't have to agree with everything you read, but, she might persuade you.
Yeah, indeed. Well, we have other people to thank before we get out of here. We got to thank Mishka, our engineer, for the great work that she always does week after week. Thanks to Ken Tamplin and Scott Van Zen for the great music. How can people contact us if they have questions or comments?
Sure, they can go to, they can send an email, as many are doing, for which we're grateful, to jeff@adnauseam.com. Don't forget the V, or to dave@adnauseam.com. Same routine. Send us your suggestions, your critiques, your angry screeds, whatever you'd like. We'd like to hear from you. Suggestions for future episodes, that kind of thing.
If you want to shout out,
we do that.
Let us know who you are. Yeah,
exactly. You can go to the Apple site or the Spotify site where you listen to us. Leave a review. Tell your friends. We'd appreciate it so much.
Yeah.
We still have some of those stickers available, right? Ad nauseum, show people you're taking in the classics.
And keeping them down.
That's right. $3.99 is kind of an impulse buy.
Yeah, exactly. Like the checkout aisle, right?
Yeah. And Jeff, what do we have on tap for next week?
Well, this was such a big episode. I feel like we need to regroup a little bit. And
hit Club Med maybe for a while.
Exactly right. Hit the beach. Just kind of let this soak in.
Which you hate, by the way.
I don't like laying on beaches, right? So the topic, to be determined.
To be determined. I like that. TBD. Could be one of our most successful, actually.
Yes, indeed. And Dave, you got the gustatory parting shout, right?
I got this one this week, and it's one I like very much. It's from an author named Nitya Prakash. I hope I pronounced his name correctly. And here it goes. I won't be impressed with technology until I can download food.
Oh, I can get behind that.
That's right. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.